In the mornings, the corridors of the grand palace smell of wax, sweat, and stale silk. While the eunuchs check the curtains and carpets, the courtiers huddle together and whisper, not about taxes and wars, but about the empress's past. They retell stories about the theater, bright makeup, nighttime parties, and cheap hotels where adult women lived by their bodies, not their names. In their retellings, the new ruler is an actress who knows all too well how much a body is worth on the market. And it is at this very moment that new laws emerge from the palace chancellery, suddenly prohibiting pimps from holding women by force and requiring the redemption of those who, until yesterday, were considered almost legal commodities. Hello. This is a story about how, at the court of Justinian and Theodora in Constantinople, dirty stories about the empress's past collided with the dry lines of laws against forced prostitution and human trafficking. It is about how, in a world where the body of a poor woman was considered a resource for the treasury, monastery shelters and harsh punishments for those who profited from the helplessness of others suddenly appeared. Write in the comments which city and country you are from and what you knew about Theodora, only as a promiscuous actress or as a figure who, together with the emperor, changed the norms regarding slavery and fallen women. I wish you attentive and thoughtful listening. Behind the mosaics and legends, you will always see the bodies redeemed from the doorsteps of brothels or broken by justice that came too late. Constantinople. At the beginning of the 6th century is not only domes and icons, but also a port where goods are unloaded every day: grain, wine, marble, and people. The empire still remembers the old Roman norms, where slavery and exploitation of the body were considered part of the order. Slaves and free poor women are sold into brothels almost without question, and the city authorities are concerned not with freedom, but with keeping tax rates and fines stable. In this reality, an actress is not just an artist. In legal terms, she belongs to the disgraceful professions, a person who goes on stage, shows her body, entertains the crowd, and very often, after the performance, is forced to sell her services to the same audience. The law makes her vulnerable. A senator has no right to marry such a woman, and in a dispute between her and a respected citizen, the court will almost automatically side with the man. Theodora appears in sources as the daughter of a racetrack employee and a dancer. Her early life is recorded in hostile texts, ironic and malicious, where every step of the young actress is blown up into a symbol of universal debauchery. But behind this caricature, we can see the familiar path of an adult woman of low birth, a childhood at the foot of the hippodrome, cheap performances, dependence on troupe owners and pimps, life in rooms where, through a thin partition, you can hear other women coughing up blood and arguing with drunk clients. For such a biography, the body is not an image or a metaphor, but the only capital that wears out quickly and almost never belongs to the woman herself. When Theodora becomes the companion of the ambitious Justinian, not yet emperor, their union seems to defy the law itself. To legalize his marriage to the former actress, the future ruler pushes for a change in the rules. The ban on marriages between members of the upper class and women of disreputable professions is lifted if they have renounced their former life. This is the first blow to the old status system, where the past was forever attached to a name. But this step is quickly followed by others, recorded in the novellas, additional laws to the main code. A new theme appears in them: the protection of those who were previously considered mere resources for brothels. Imperial texts began to record what had been considered a private matter for centuries. Justinian's novellas state that courts are prohibited from recognizing contracts under which a free woman is given to a brothel in order to pay off a debt. Articles were introduced stating that pimps did not have the right to hold an adult woman by force or threats, even if she had been paid for. If relatives or benefactors redeemed her, the brothel owner was obliged to release her, and could not demand that she return to her former trade. Where the law previously described the procedure for imposing fines on brothels, there are now provisions on redemption and release. This is a blow to the urban economy. The familiar market for bodies is suddenly confronted with a norm that values freedom over income. Sources describe even more radical measures directly linked to Theodora. The chronicler John Malalas reports that the empress achieved the closure of the capital's large brothels and the redemption of the women who were kept there. A special monastery was organized for the freed women on the Asian shore of the strait, symbolically named metanoia, repentance, or changeability. In the official version, it was a shelter where former prostitutes could live under the protection of the church, learn crafts, pray, and gradually rebuild their lives. They are given clothes, a small gold coin as a starting fund, and the road back to the brothel is closed to them. A return to their former profession is now considered a violation not only of moral law, but also of imperial law. Not all sources paint this reform in a positive light. In a secret chronicle written by a hostile lawyer, the same monastery is described as a place of forced confinement. Allegedly, women were herded there against their will, cutting off their usual means of earning a living, and some of them preferred death to a new life under supervision. This text is often quoted by those who want to portray Theodora as nothing more than a cruel hypocrite. But it also shows something else. Even her opponents acknowledge that the empress intervened in the very structure of the sex trade, taking hundreds of adult women away from pimps and placing them under the protection of monastery walls. Her supporters emphasize that this was not a case of arbitrary deprivation of liberty, but a transfer from virtual slavery to a protected status, where at least they were not beaten, sold, or given to clients for the night. Outside the monastery, the laws also tightened the noose around those who profited from coercion. Justinian's novellas toughened the penalties for brothel owners who trapped poor women in debt and did not release them until they had worked off their bodies to exhaustion. Those who tried to take an adult woman to another city or even another province to sell her to a brothel faced confiscation of property, exile, and severe corporal punishment. Legal language began to include a formula that essentially equated such trade with the kidnapping of free people. For a society still living with the customs of late Rome, this was a serious shift. What yesterday was considered part of the city's craft was today declared a violation of imperial order. Outside, these changes are met with whispers and resistance. For some senators and wealthy citizens, accustomed to brothels and theaters, providing entertainment and fueling the gray economy, the empress's intervention looks like the destruction of the natural order. They whisper that Theodora, with her past as an actress, is now taking revenge on her former masters and closing off their source of income. There are stories that some influential people complain about the undermining of customs, the blurring of the boundaries between free and fallen women, and the fact that it has now become dangerous to even take a maid into the house without fear of being accused of violence. Formally, these complaints are rarely recorded, but the very need for defensive wording in the laws shows that the resistance was palpable. The myth that will survive through the centuries will choose only one side of this story. In the popular imagination, Theodora will remain primarily a symbol of debauchery, an actress, a mistress, a woman with an indecent youth who accidentally found herself on the throne. Her mosaic image will be talked about as a contrast between glamour and a dirty past. But documents, dry novellas, and chronicles show a different line. It was under her political influence that the empire intervened most harshly in the market of forced prostitution, banned contracts that turned need into lifelong slavery, and created institutions where ransomed women were given a chance to live not as commodities. The gap between this paper reality and the whispering courtiers is the place to start figuring out how the empire, with its scandalous empress, tried to find early forms of anti-slavery, and why the next century chose to forget the laws and remember only the labels. On closer inspection, these reforms turn out to be not a beautiful gesture of a repentant sinner, but part of a harsh legal machine that Justinian and Theodora launched on several fronts at once. In their codification of old Roman laws and new novellas, a special figure appears, the pimp as a person who consciously lives off the body of another. He is no longer described as a semi-legal master of the craft, as was tolerated in late Rome. He is placed in a separate category of people whose rights have been violated. Such a person loses part of his civil honor, cannot hold office, and loses the opportunity to appear in court as an equal. The novellas stipulate that if an adult woman is held in a house and forced to receive clients under threat of starvation, beatings, or being handed over to the authorities, it is not a house of debauchery, but a place of crime. The legal language of these texts is dry, but behind it, one can see the concrete life of the neighborhoods near the racetrack and the port streets, where before the reform, the owner of a brothel could calmly declare that a woman had signed an agreement to work with her body in order to pay off a debt or support herself. Now this argument no longer works. The law clearly states that a contract concluded under pressure, threat, or out of necessity cannot turn a free person into a de facto slave. If a woman claims that she was forced, her word must be considered, not automatically dismissed as the lie of a fallen woman. For a world where the stigma of a profession was equivalent to a sentence, this is a break with the established order. Byzantine lawyers also established mechanisms for redemption. Relatives, benefactors, and even wealthy strangers were officially allowed to redeem adult women from brothels, and owners were prohibited from demanding their return. If a pimp refused to release a redeemed woman, he risked being charged with unlawful detention. For brothels, this was a blow to their stability. They were transformed from a semi-legal business with permanent staff into a constant risk of losing women and money. For women, this was the first chance that the arrival of a man with a wallet and a seal might mean not the purchase of their bodies, but a way out of a vicious circle. On a day-to-day level, things look less rosy. The neighborhoods where brothels operate remain dirty, cramped, and full of adult bodies ravaged by infections and beatings. Diseases transmitted through close contact are described in the medicine of the time as ulcers, rashes, and constant pain in the lower abdomen. Doctors know that many women in this profession suffer from premature joint pain, tooth loss due to poor nutrition and scarred skin. Brothels are located near the baths, the hippodrome, and the docks, and at night they are frequented by those returning from unloading ships, training, and entertainment at the circus. The laws passed in the imperial palace cannot dry up this network in a single day, but they begin to remove people from it piece by piece and declare old forms of violence unacceptable. Theodora's role can be seen not only in individual stories, but also in the nature of the measures taken. Chroniclers note that she particularly insisted that women who had been ransomed from brothels should not simply be thrown out onto the streets. A monastery shelter was organized for them, not on the outskirts, but at an important point where it could be easily reached by water. The descriptions say that some of the women resisted. They were used to the freedom of the street, even if it was scary, and did not believe in protection behind monastery walls. They had to relearn how to live without a constant stream of clients, with a routine, obedience, and prayer. For some, this was their first experience of a space where the doors were locked at night, not to keep them from going out to clients, but to keep anyone from coming in. Opponents used this monastery as a convenient target for accusations. In hostile texts, it is portrayed almost as a prison, where the empress allegedly locks up women in order to erase their past and strengthen her own reputation. But even these sources do not deny the basic fact. Before her intervention, these adult women were pure commodities on the city market. After, they found themselves in a status where they could not be sold further. The fact that the regime inside the monastery was strict does not negate this transition. A historian who reads both propaganda attacks and dry excerpts from laws sees here not romantic repentance, but a crude attempt by the empire to transfer some people from a gray zone of violence to a strictly regulated but more protected system. It is not surprising that the senatorial milieu reacted painfully. For part of the aristocracy, brothels were not only a place of entertainment, but also part of a chain of patronage. The owner of the house, who paid taxes and provided services to influential guests when necessary, became a useful client. Now, however, he risked becoming a criminal if his affairs came to the attention of the imperial lawyers. In private conversations, it was said that the laws on the redemption and protection of women undermine custom, blur the difference between decent and corrupt, and interfere with the free disposal of property. Rumors linked these reforms to Theodora's personal will. They said that she was allegedly imposing her traumas on the empire and turning her individual biography into the norm for everyone. Against this backdrop, the fact that Justinian did not limit himself to the female sphere takes on particular significance. In parallel with the reforms in the field of prostitution, he changed the rules concerning slavery in general. The procedure for turning a free person into a slave for debts became more complicated. The paths to liberation became easier, and the practice was legalized, whereby a master who released a slave did so not only as a private act of kindness, but also as a step backed by imperial law. In this general line of weakening slavery, the laws on pimps and brothels do not appear to be a random whim of the empress with a past, but part of a broader program in which the authorities attempt to control the movement of people in the same way that they control silver, grain, and land. Meanwhile, life in Constantinople reminds us every day how much any deviation from the norm costs. In the evenings, the crowd at the hippodrome barks not only the names of the teams, but also rumors about the court. People discuss tax increases, rumors of war on the borders, and epidemics that periodically sweep through the cramped neighborhoods. Amid this noise, stories of closed brothels and women taken to convents become part of the general discontent and hopes. For some, this is a sign that the empire is meddling in private affairs. For others, it is a rare example of the law at least occasionally siding with the most vulnerable adults, whom no one usually asks if they want to live differently. The myth of Theodora, as a symbol of debauchery, fits conveniently into the male habit of explaining unpleasant reforms by referring to the personal vices of women. It is easier to say that laws against pimps are the whim of a former actress than to admit that the empire saw the market for forced prostitution as a threat to order and demographics. From the point of view of the treasury, every woman broken by disease and violence in a brothel is a lost workforce, lost taxes from trade, and a risk of epidemics. From the point of view of the army, it is a reduction in the population from which soldiers are recruited a generation later. Behind the pathos of Christian rhetoric about purity in these laws lies the cold calculation of human resource management. The shift in which monastery shelters under Theodora's patronage began to replace some of the city's brothels seems ambiguous. On the one hand, women received protection from direct violence and the right to be bought and sold. On the other hand, their freedom of movement and choice of lifestyle is limited by monastic rules, fasting, and obedience. But if we compare the two systems through the eyes of the law at that time, the difference is fundamental. In a monastery, they cannot be forced to sell their bodies as a service. If they violate the rules, they can be punished, deprived of part of their food, locked in their cells, but they will not be put on the market as commodities. This is the minimum that the empire finds it possible to enshrine in law, and the maximum that it is willing to go to in reality for the sake of the lowest class of people. This is one of the darkest features of the history of Justinian and Theodora. The same authority that ordered the suppression of the rebellion at the Hippodrome at the cost of thousands of adult men's lives, could, at other times, write laws protecting adult women from pimps. The same hand that signed death warrants also signed novellas freeing those who had been ransomed from brothels. To the modern viewer, this sounds like hypocrisy. To the historian, it sounds like the reality of imperial politics, where the human body is always an instrument, sometimes as an object of intimidation, sometimes as a resource to be protected. And in this reality, a female figure with a scandalous biography unexpectedly becomes one of those who pushes for early forms of protection against human trafficking, even if the next generation prefers to remember only her youth on stage and not the lines with which she and the emperor crushed the old market of forced labor. In practice, these harsh formulas turned into a chain of small, dirty deeds that rarely made it into the glossy chronicles, but settled in the reports of officials and court cases. In port cities, there were reports of adult women who were not allowed ashore by ship owners until they had worked off their passage with their bodies. In the neighborhoods of Constantinople, there were houses where rooms were rented out, not as living quarters, but as cages. The landlady or landlord kept the women in debt for food and clothing, forcing them to take clients. In the old language, this was called patronage, but in Justinian's new laws, it was called hidden slavery of free people, disguised as debt and duty. Doctors working at court and in city infirmaries describe the consequences without embellishment. Their treatises mention adult women with chronic inflammation, infertility, and constant bleeding after years of living in cramped, poorly ventilated rooms where dozens of men passed through their bodies. Added to this were skin diseases, exhaustion, and signs of beatings. In crowded neighborhoods, infections spread to servants, clients, and then to their homes. For an empire that feared epidemics and the loss of labor, this became not only a problem of morals, but also of survival. Laws against pimps and forced prostitution were in the same category as rules about bathhouses and meat shops, to reduce the number of places where filth and violence turned people into breeding grounds for disease. The imperial authorities responded with their usual tool, novellas. These stipulated that an adult man who forced a free woman into prostitution would be deprived of his rights to her property and could be punished by exile, confiscation, and corporal punishment. It was specifically noted that a patron who financed a brothel was responsible along with those who directly kept women in submission. The idea of removing those who had been rescued from their former status was repeated. It was forbidden to refer to their past life as a reason to return them. If a woman was ransomed or accepted into a monastery shelter, any attempt to drag her back into a house of violence was treated as a crime. For a society where the stigma usually remained forever, this was a dramatic legal shift. In practice, of course, everything broke down due to habit. A provincial official could ignore a complaint if he was connected to wealthy local people. Guards accepted money for forgetfulness and turned a blind eye to illegal houses. The monastery shelters described in novels turned out to be overcrowded. There was not enough food and clothing, and some women could not endure the strict rules and returned to the streets. Some reports mentioned fugitives who disappeared from the sight of both the church and the authorities. The story did not turn into a clear victory for humanity. It was more of a struggle to give at least some of the women a chance to escape, rather than a guaranteed path from one master to another. Resistance from above was built around the figure of Theodora herself. Senators and city nobles, irritated by taxes and military expenses, enjoyed telling stories about her past, portraying the reforms as the personal whim of a former actress. It was in their interest to explain the prohibitions not as protection for adult women, but as an attempt by one particular empress to rewrite the rules to suit herself. In this myth, the blow to pimps did not look like a blow to the sex trade, but like a private vendetta by a woman of low birth against the world that had once used her. In this way, the senators tried to discredit the laws themselves, turning them into a continuation of her biography. However, the documents paint a different picture. The name of Theodora is not always mentioned in the texts of the novellas, but the language stubbornly links the ban on forced prostitution with order in the cities, care for the workforce, and the role of the church as a partner in redemption and shelter. Bishops were allowed to take women from violent homes, organize monastic shelters for them, and demand that local authorities enforce the laws. The empire viewed these women as people who could work, trade, give birth to future taxpayers and soldiers, rather than die at the age of 40 in a dirty bed. This pragmatism was the nerve center of the reforms. It was not about rehabilitating debauchery, but about limiting one of the most destructive ways of turning a free body into a commodity. The darkest twist came later in how the memory of this period was rewritten. Subsequent generations of authors happily repeated rumors about Theodora's youth, exaggerated her sinfulness, and loved the contrast between actress and empress. In mosaics, she was frozen in gold and jewels as a symbol of the court, not as a participant in reforms. Between the images of the prostitute and the holy ruler, there was no room for discussion of laws against human trafficking. Law schools continued to study Justinian's novellas as part of the body of law, and provincial judges referred to them when dealing with cases of coercion. But what remained in the collective memory was what was more pleasant to retell: gossip about the body, rather than the text that limited power over other people's bodies. It is in this discrepancy between myth and paper that the main nerve of the story can be felt. The empress with a tainted biography became one of those who pushed the boundaries of permissible violence and was then turned into a convenient symbol, designed to shield her own reformist work. But the laws written in the capital had to pass through another filter: the walls of real monasteries and shelters. The texts of the novellas contain an almost solemn formula. Women rescued from houses of violence can find refuge in the church. Monasteries are obliged to accept them, and no one has the right to take them back. In reality, this meant that new adult women, often sick, impoverished, and broken by long years of coercion, were added to already overcrowded communities. Abbesses wrote to Constantinople complaining about the lack of bread, clothing, and beds. Some monasteries refused to accept newcomers, citing the charter and lack of funds. Others, on the contrary, became the very shelters that lawyers had dreamed of. In essence, the first state church instrument for removing people from the sex trade. Where before the reform, women found themselves on the street or in cheap brothels after their careers failed, they now had a chance to disappear from the sight of pimps and creditors, albeit at the cost of a harsh regime, hard labor, and strict rules of conduct. This new practice was monitored not only by the court, but also by local bishops. Their correspondence with Constantinople reveals details that rarely appear in glowing eulogies. They describe adult women who cannot stand the seclusion of the monastery and try to escape. Cases where former owners send people to the gates to persuade or threaten them to return their lost property. The bishops demand support. They need soldiers to drive away such patrons and money to feed those whom the imperial authorities have ordered to be ransomed. From the point of view of Theodora and Justinian, the monastery shelter was supposed to be an alternative to brothels. But from the point of view of provincial administrations, it was yet another expense and a reason for conflict with the local nobility, who were accustomed to considering access to the bodies of poor women part of their unofficial status. The resistance of the elites did not disappear. It simply changed its language. Stories circulated in senatorial circles that the empire was allegedly disrupting the order, destroying old agreements, depriving households of servants and the customary decoration of feasts. In private homes, there are complaints that women from the lower classes having been given the opportunity to enter a convent, are becoming less submissive, arguing more often, demanding payment for their labor, and threatening to appeal to the bishop. At the level of rumor, the reforms of Theodora and Justinian become a dangerous precedent. The authorities have recognized the right of poor adult women to refuse, and this undermines the usual hierarchy. Those who are used to seeing them as expendable material for the urban economy begin to talk about undermining tradition and untimely leniency. Meanwhile, the legal apparatus established harsh consequences for those who continued to work under the old rules. Later, novellas increased the penalties for human trafficking, confiscation of property, prohibition from holding office, and exile. In particularly serious cases, corporal punishment is allowed, up to and including the death penalty for those who, despite warnings, persist in keeping forced laborers in their homes, trading people as commodities, and obstructing the work of church shelters. For the cities of the Eastern Empire, this became a signal. From that moment on, the business of exploiting free women was officially classified as a crime against public order rather than a tolerated, albeit despised, practice. Yes, enforcement remained patchy, and corruption did not disappear, but the line was drawn in the law. In the centuries that followed, it was precisely this line that would prove almost invisible to popular memory. Chronicles and anecdotes would relish the details of Theodora's past, describing her as the embodiment of debauchery, turning her story into a convenient plot about the sin that climbed onto the throne. Writers of the late imperial and post-imperial periods would repeat scenes from contemporary hostile journalism, amplifying them and adding details that even her detractors did not know. Against this backdrop, the dry lines of novels about the prohibition of coercion, the redemption of women, and the responsibility of pimps will remain in the world of lawyers and legal historians. For most readers, the image of the Empress will forever be associated with theater and scandal, rather than with the fact that, with her participation, the empire became one of the first major states where the trade in the bodies of free people was declared a crime and classified as an offense, punishable not only before God, but also before the courts. The final irony of this story is that the woman whose youth had been used against her for centuries, at the height of her power, directed this memory not toward defending the rights of the powerful, but toward striking a blow against the model market of violence. And it was precisely this blow that the mass myth tried to forget most quickly.